I didn't know that. She told me the story that she testified at a hearing and I heard on the spot. She was a friend. She got there. She was very, very good. Oh, she was wonderful. She and Ted, best buddies, got a lot of stuff done.
The only person that doesn't get enough credit
It's a good idea. Why would they have the same thing?
He kind of person. This guy put together big glimmers there. It was London for the 90 days.
Those well, they got Alzheimer's. That's what I was really defined. That was really the first significant. Prior to that, there was always saying, "Thou shalt do more," without any money. Just find a way to do it.
Okay, tell me your story.
He was what's the conference? So what's happening? Where's policy? Still? Oh, you should talk to Dan Sarah. He's the geologist here. Just talk about yesterday. He was talking about the political use of numbers. Now, and the leak rate, he shows the rate estimates, Los Alamos, how they would never reconcile that. That would always be the politics. Real. So, what is the politics of instead of what is there in the culture? Just terrorize. So, is there really any value in this? They want the Bible to be the way it's going. And there's some truth in that, right? How are you? Sodom, do you have any slides? No. Okay. So you know, in fact, what we might do is just sit down the whole time. We might just sit at the table and have a chat. Kevin, how are you? Good to see you. Nice to see you over here again.
Yeah, well,
You know, we're just gonna have to issue get you an office over here. How are you?
I'm good.
You did a beautiful job.
So,
Yeah. You scored that.
JD was
The program. Academy. Somebody is it's your old home, so you got the woman. Where did you get it?
oh, I would your eyes. Is this the issue that I was talking about in the emergency we talked about 3 or 4 times?
No. This one emerged from a workshop on OTA.
A workshop on OTA?
Yeah. At Georgetown. At Georgetown Hall.
Georgetown.
Now it's different.
Are you involved with the discussions about the possibility of OTA? Should I put it on any practice focus?
Talk about the kind of issues.
So, and is he policy director?
All right.
At the Alzheimer's Association now?
No,
at the
he's
association now,
the
right?
executive editor of the journal.
Okay.
His background is in epidemiology, biostatistics. He studied with John Brecker at Hopkins.
Really?
Then he was regulatory affairs person for an Italian company for a number of years. Then when I started the journal, he joined as the executive editor, so that makes sure that thing goes down. And he helps me with a lot of the think tanks that we do. We've done a number of think tanks under the heading of HEAD 2020, which is
I'm on the podium for today.
I agree with you. It can become, in this chronic climate, it can become a nuisance or a bit.
Hi, I'm Dan, a colleague of Bob's.
So, Dan, do you know Tom Cottle? You need to go introduce yourself. Tom, come up here.
I don't think I do. But thank you for agreeing. Excuse me. Thank you for agreeing to do this morning.
Oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
Speaking of fantastic, it's Chuck Weiss. Hi, I'm Dan Sarah.
Tom, I wanted you guys to
Your
introduce
familiar name. So.
Tom.
Did we get their former life?
Yes, you should have. So Tom was at OTA and did nuclear waste.
Okay, then we would have met when I was on the Hill in the early.
And I was telling him your story from the other day.
Do you know the Glory 36 story?
Oh, yeah.
It's unbelievable. It is wonderful, yes. No, they gave it to UNLV to do a third, and they couldn't, because it turns out to be a sample prep thing, so it requires a new theory about grain size and adhesion and all this other stuff, so. It's great.
Anyway, I wanted you guys to meet.
Yeah,
So.
right, we did, because your name was very familiar, so, okay, all right, well, great to reconnect. Yeah.
Oh, let me
So,
get a copy of
you
it.
know Dan Matley?
Oh, sure. I need to be seen. He gets to be the fire. I don't know. Really? It's all.
She looks like she's 18.
It is unbelievable, isn't it? After all that work you do, it's worse. And yet, it is straight. You know, and I think that's literally true. And then, it's different for politics. You know, it's small, it's 90 years old. But anyway, my dad. Something that I remember, and the option is not talking to the higher up. Hey, after the way before that got back. So there was clearly they were happy for it. I get it. Much smaller than it was when I came in. When I came in OG, so no capacity. Lost all that stuff. You lose it. It's not gone. You're losing it.
Blinder.
So where did you go?
The other piece of the project is what you're talking about. There's a lot. Technical aspect. I don't
Somebody else.
a few weeks
It's going to get find a little bit of homeless house. It's going to get
I think she must be the brain.
And if it's spend money, it doesn't. Right. Do you read budget? That's the problem. It's totally dysfunctional.
I'm gonna try to get it.
Shortly after that. Yeah, it is, it's gotten a scandal, especially it's one of those. And you're going to, particularly where you
Well, you also wind up with fiscal.
Realize that.
Sure. But you're right, I think you'll run I did not realize that. I've just bought a quarter. Because I mean, there no, that guy would know this. That's why I was on for surrogate. I'm sorry. All right, the line between policy. Which one? Oh, well, yeah, that one took a year and a half. But it wasn't me. As you'll hear, it's huge. Yeah, yeah. We need to get started, right? Yes, we need to get started. Where are the subscription cards?
Well, you have some inside.
Was at the National Institute on Aging, and he was kind of just calling the impresario of Alzheimer's.
Not the emperor.
Well, he was.
May I go? Yes. Thank you, boss. So, okay. Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Dan Sarowitz at the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes here at the Arizona State University Embassy. This morning we have one of our quarterly events to roll out our latest issue of Issues in Science and Technology, to which you should all subscribe. It's very reasonable. It's a beautiful magazine. Kevin Finneran, the editor-in-chief, and I, and Kevin and Jay Lloyd and others work very hard on it for your benefit. So we hope you'll enjoy it. And what we do each quarter is we have one of the authors of one of our fabulous articles talk a bit about what they write about. I'm not going to say anything about the median age of this crowd. I'll just say I have a particular abiding interest in this subject, which is the great difficulty of making progress on understanding, preventing, treating, caring for people with Alzheimer's disease. And so my colleague here at ASU, Bob Cook-Deegan, has written a wonderful, I'll say, very complex but entirely comprehensible article about the history of Alzheimer's treatment and a dual history of, or Alzheimer's research and a dual history of technology assessment and the influence and interactions between the two. So there's all sorts of lessons both for Alzheimer's and beyond that, but it's a wonderful article. There's another article on Alzheimer's by a neuroscience funder, Susan Fitzpatrick, who takes, from a different angle, a similar perspective about how we need to rethink our approach because we haven't made progress. So Bob will talk a bit about his article, all neurodegenerative maladies, but it's Zaven Khatchaturian, who was at the National Institute on Aging. You're emeritus at this point. And we'll have a perspective from inside the major research institute aimed at Alzheimer's on what's been going on. So I'm going to shut up, turn it over to them. The way we work things, as most of you know, since most of you look like repeat offenders here, is they will talk for 35, 40 minutes or so. We'll open it up for conversation. We'll wrap up at around 10 or shortly after, maybe 10:10. And then, but we invite everyone to please stay around, continue talking, trade business cards, keep the conversation going. So, and also, let's see, I'm supposed to remind everyone that when you ask your questions, make your comments, engage the audience towards the end, please wait for the microphone to show up since we are live streaming this. So let me turn it over to Bob, and thank you both for being with us this morning. Yeah.
Okay, so, and can you hear us in the back? Okay, so we're going to just have a conversation here. And we're going old school. Neither of us has any slides, so you can celebrate right now. And we're going to tell the story and the origin of this article in this issue, and incidentally, the artwork and stuff like that. There's not just the article by Susan Fitzpatrick, who is the president of the James O'Donnell Foundation, the O'Donnell Aircraft Foundation that was created. It's based in the Midwest, and they are a major funder of neuroscience. So she also did a piece that I didn't even know was happening, but somebody at the top was orchestrating a coherent issue. And they also found an artist who developed Alzheimer's disease, and the art itself kind of exhibits the symptoms that develop during Alzheimer's disease. So, and as usual, Jay and his team have done a beautiful job of pulling together artwork that, I mean, it's like a real magazine, guys. And even though it's about science and technology, it's not boring. We're trying to make it not boring. So pick up your copy and take it with you. We're also going to go old school in two respects. The origin for this article came from a meeting that happened at Georgetown Law School in June. And the topic was not Alzheimer's disease. The topic was, should we have, how do we improve the process of dealing with science and technology in the US Congress? How can we improve the flow of information into the policy-making apparatus to the first branch of government? And in the process of having that debate about should there be an Office of Technology Assessment, should we bring it back? Rush Holt, the current head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, he is the guy who kept introducing this bill Congress after Congress, trying to bring back OTA. He's now at AAAS, and he basically said, oh, blah, blah, blah. When I used to go on the Hill, they would always talk about the Bible of Alzheimer's disease policy, which is this OTA report that came out in 1987. And so the article is partly about what have we learned about science and technology policy. And one of the surprising findings, just to cut to the chase, is we were actually asked to do this at a time when Alzheimer's disease was not a household word. And we have the incredible pleasure of having one of the people who was most responsible for actually developing a coherent research policy for Alzheimer's disease sitting at the table with me. Zavin knows like 3 orders of magnitude more about the science of Alzheimer's disease than I do, and than probably almost anybody else. He was already in place, working at the National Institute on Aging at the time that this project emerged. And in fact, he kind of joined us on staff once a week and came down and sat in our offices at 6th and Pennsylvania Southeast. And he knew everybody in the field because it was an emerging field, but it was a very small field. Why was it small? Because until 1977, Alzheimer's disease was the term that was used for people whose brains began to fail before age 65. And the term that was used for people whose brains began to feel, whose memories began to fail later, and whose cognition was beginning to lose a stride or two, that was called senile dementia, or even worse, arteriosclerosis of the brain, on the assumption that it was just kind of a natural thing that happened. And Bob Katzman, a neurologist, a really prominent and brilliant neurologist, wrote an article that kind of caught fire and changed the terminology of Alzheimer's disease to say, you know what, when you look at the brains of people who get the same condition in their 60s and 70s, it looks exactly the same as the people who are getting this thing we call Alzheimer's disease in their 40s and 50s. So why are we calling these things two different things? We shouldn't. This is Alzheimer's disease. It's a disease. And people's brains are failing because the cells are dying, and they're dying because they have a disease. So that changed the terminology, and that happened at more or less the same time, late 1970s, early 1980s, when not just in Alzheimer's disease, but in many other disease conditions, think of breast cancer, think of diabetes, think of other conditions where people were beginning to find each other through social networks and build support groups outside the medical system. So in the field of Alzheimer's disease, groups had popped up all over the United States. There was a big one in Chicago. There's another big one in Minnesota. And there happened to be one in Denver, Colorado, which is where I was a medical student when I was a freshman medical student. And we decided to start doing research on Alzheimer's disease when it was not a household word. And in fact, we decided to focus on a form of Alzheimer's disease that was inherited in families. And it had actually been forgotten by most people in literature, not everybody. Zavin almost certainly would have known about the inherited forms of Alzheimer's disease. But most people, the standard textbook from Lord Brain in the UK said flat out it is not inherited. So lesson one for anybody who studies science and technology policy, that was the scientific voice of authority saying Alzheimer's disease is not inherited, and it is provably false. But it was the general consensus at the time. So at the University of Colorado, we started studying a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to do something very old school here, which is actually hold up these things called books that we used to use. And this is, I'll hand this around. This is actually not from Alzheimer's disease. This is how I got involved in the Human Genome Project. This is a pedigree, part of a pedigree of a very large family that lived in the panhandle of Oklahoma. I can say their name because they've published a book about their family experience. It's the Reiswig family. And it was 4 generations of people who had that had the inheritance pattern of Mendel's P's of a dominant trait. That is, anybody who was affected with Alzheimer's disease, their children were at 50% risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. And there was this one sibship of 14 brothers and sisters, believe this, 14 brothers and sisters from the same mother and father. 11 of them developed Alzheimer's disease. Number 10 in that list was a guy named Ralph Reiswig, whose wife had become an evangelical preacher, and she would drive around the western United States in her car. She drove at 80 miles an hour in her Dodge Colt. She terrified me, and I drive fast, but she drove way faster than me. And she would, every place that she would go that had a medical school, she would call somebody up and say, "Have you guys ever heard of families getting Alzheimer's disease?" And on one of her stops, she was going through Colorado, she called up the head of the neurology department at the University of Colorado and said, "Have you guys heard of Alzheimer's?" He said, "Well, yeah, in fact, I've got a guy sitting here in my office. I happened to be sitting in his office when she called." And he said, "You know what, we wanted to do a study of families like yours because we think there might be a broken gene to be found." Derek, am I being picked up? We're okay? Okay. So that began the process of trying to assemble the pedigree of, if you do the whole, she came in with a bunch of butcher paper. She slapped it down and it was like this big. She had over 400 people in her pedigree. And we've simplified it here. But this was a family that had more than 100 people who were at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. These are families that know what it means when you get Alzheimer's disease because they've experienced it and they've shared it at family reunions every year. They know the devastation of this disease. So at the University of Colorado, we had been studying the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. And my job as a medical student was to go out and meet with these families and basically say, what do we know this year? What do we know this year? This is 1976, 1977, though. Please note, Human Genome Project wasn't even conceived of until 1985. The idea of having a map of the human chromosomes that we could use to identify, to link the inheritance pattern of a condition like this with where is it located on the chromosomes, that idea was not published until 1980. So what we could do is assemble a wonderful pedigree that maybe somebody would be able to use someday to find a broken gene, because we know there's a broken gene when you see this inheritance pattern. But we did not have the technical wherewithal to be able to do anything with the family. So we assembled this beautiful family. They're incredibly generous with their information. And I went on and did oncogene research because that seemed much more promising. And it was. It was an incredibly exciting time for oncogenes. But cutting a long and circuitous story short, I came to Washington for the first time in 1982, and I worked at a place called the Office of Technology Assessment as a congressional fellow through the AAAS program that brings science, people coming from science onto the Hill. So I came as a AAAS fellow, and I worked at the Office of Technology Assessment. And the reason they wanted me was not because of anything having to do with the cancer research that I was involved with. It was the fact that they were doing a project on aging that Zavin had been partly instrumental in getting started at OTA. And within that project on aging, they had realized, you know what, this idea of Alzheimer's disease it's becoming a national movement. And what had happened at the social level is these groups that had popped up of families that wanted to support each other in dealing with this devastating disease had at the national level kind of found each other, and they had formed what is now called the Alzheimer's Association. And they were trying to say, what can we do about this? And they had realized one of the most obvious things that you can do about Alzheimer's disease is let's start doing some research on it, so maybe if we understand it, we can fix it. So the idea was, let's have a national lobbying effort to build support for Congress giving money for Alzheimer's disease research. That had begun to happen, but the political nexus was actually support groups that found each other and formed a national organization. So the terminology had changed. So Alzheimer's disease, instead of affecting a few 100,000 people, suddenly is affecting millions of Americans because the terminology has changed. A support movement has coalesced into a national organization, and the seeds of a research movement have already been planted in the National Institutes of Health and elsewhere. And final little wrinkle in this story is Alzheimer's disease was kind of split among institutes at the National Institutes of Health. Split in what sense? Well, we have an Institute for Mental Health that's the home ground for psychiatrists and psychologists. And we had another institute, which at that point was neurological and communicative disorders and stroke. That's the playing ground for neurologists. And neurologists and psychiatrists at the beginning of the 20th century were the same thing. But by the end of the 20th century, boy, they were pretty separate. And the neurologists were doing neurology and organic brain diseases, and psychiatrists were dealing with the diagnostic and statistical manual and being very rigorous about the classification of symptoms. But they were largely different domains. And there was a new kid on the block, which was a new institute that was created in the 1970s called the National Institute on Aging. And Alzheimer's disease was one of those things that split among those three administrative units within the National Institutes of Health. So if you're going to form a research consortium, who's going to be involved? You're going to have all three of those institutes involved. So Zavin was the point person at the National Institute on Aging. Kit Bick was at the Neurology Institute, and Gene Cohen was at the Mental Health Institute. And between them, they were coordinating effectively. The Troika was they were the three people who were trying to build up a research movement for Alzheimer's disease. I'll make one more transition, which is, what's this got to do with Congress? So we're doing this project on aging, technology and aging in America at OTA, and that's why I was hired as a fellow, because they wanted somebody who knew a little bit about Alzheimer's disease come to be part of their project team. As that project was winding down, we did something that probably we should have done more systematically at OTA. We went around to the staff people that we were working with on the Hill, of both parties, both houses, and all the subcommittees. I think we had 32 subcommittees and committees that we were dealing with. And we met with every single one of them. And we basically said, how could we be useful at OTA? And we went in with a list of about 10 or 15 ideas, most of them having to do with biotechnology or genetics or whatever, because that's what we cared about the most. But in one of those meetings, we met with David Sundwall, who was a family physician who was working for Now, why is that an issue for the Hill? Well, you have an emerging social movement that's trying to deal with a really devastating human problem of people whose brains are short, which is not just about research. And it wasn't just about science and technology, unless you mean technology in a really, really broad sense. And one of the things that was most significant about this, I was the molecular biologist who was on this team. But we actually have a chapter in here, believe it or not. Here's a congressional report that has a chapter in it called The Family. And that chapter was written by a woman called Nancy Mace, who had written a book called The 36-Hour Day, which was the Bible of how do you take care of your relative who has Alzheimer's disease. The technology there is not molecules and cell biology. The technology there is, what can we learn about how to deal with people, the human beings who develop this devastating disease, in a better way over time. And at that time, our policy was basically, you get Alzheimer's disease, it's your family's problem. Unless you spend down, and then it will become our problem, not through a systematic federal policy, but because you're going to run out of money on Medicaid, Medicare does not cover long-term care, but Medicaid does. And therefore, your relative is going to end up in a nursing home being paid for by the citizens of the United States of America and the states through the Medicaid program. That's pretty much where we still are, frankly. But this was long-term care policy. It was family. How are families dealing with this? How's the medical system doing the diagnosis and treatment? And then what can we do in the long run to have a research strategy to mitigate the disease over time? So this article is really about 30 years later, what have we learned? And one of the things, I'll finish with this, one of the things that I learned out of this process is this report came out in April of 1987. The report is kind of a compendium of all the stuff that we'd learned. And as you can see, how many congressional staff do you think read this book cover to cover? It's not zero, incidentally. There were some who did. But this was a compendium of useful information that is most useful for people who take little sliver of it. They take one chapter of it and they do the policy stuff that's related to that one chapter. So there's something on research, and there's something about long-term care financing. There's Medicaid eligibility. An incredibly good lawyer, David Chapkin, wrote a chapter on how do you decide whether somebody's eligible for Medicaid. And if you've ever worked in Medicaid, it is 57 different programs. Every state and territory and the District of Columbia have different rules for Medicaid. It's completely incoherent. But he did this beautiful algorithm of how do you figure out who's eligible for Medicaid. So all of that was in here as a compendium, but the report for political purposes did not matter. Because the legislation that came out of this process, and it wasn't OTA, it was the world discovering we got to do something about Alzheimer's disease, and channeling that through their representatives in Congress who were passing bills. And one of those bills is an appropriation bill that is boosting the budget for NIA and NIMH and NINCDS at NIH. Another bill is to create a Medicare demonstration program. And another bill was, hey, let's have a program that looks at how do we take care of people with dementia, that emerged out of the authorization committees in the House and the Senate, particularly the Senate. So it's a really complicated story, but one of the little gems that came out of this process is while we were doing the study, there were some really creative staff at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation up in Princeton, New Jersey, who were following this same domain of policy and kind of got pulled into the Washington nexus through all these meetings that we were holding and all these contract reports that we were doing at OTA. And they started meeting with the congressional staff. But they had a staff person there named Jeff Merrill and another staff person, Carolyn Asbury, who had decided, you know what, the really most important thing that we could do as a private foundation is instead of having this binary choice of you deal with it in your family or you send your relative to a nursing home and they have to move out of your house, what's missing is a whole set of services for taking care of people who have dementia, but the family doesn't need to completely move that person into a nursing home. Let's think about having daycare and respite care. Drop your relative off so you can get relief for a few days and do some chores and things like that. Those services were beginning to exist in the real world, but there was no nexus of expertise and there was no policy to support that, and there was no research on how do we do that better. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did something that I thought was a horrible idea. They started a grants program and said, the condition of getting a grant from us is that you're going to be part of a national network of groups that are trying to develop these respite and daycare services, but we're only going to give you the money if you come in with a business plan that says we're going to step down from 100% funding the first year, 80%, 60%, 40%, 20%. So year 5, you're on your own. You don't get any more money from us. I thought it was a horrible idea. because I thought there's just no way that these centers are going to be self-sustaining. And it turns out I was dead wrong. That became the nexus for a whole movement of people who were supplying these services and actually figured out how to get people to pay for this service to take care of people whose brains were failing. So that was something that I learned by being part of a social, complicated social process. And it also illustrates two things about Washington, D.C. One is that not everything happens through Congress. The crucial player in the development of these day and respite care services was actually a private foundation. And even more importantly, it was that network of people who were beginning to deliver these services all over the country who hadn't had a way of finding each other until there was a central repository and a source of funding through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that kind of galvanized this into a real mini field. And it actually spread out to long-term care way beyond Alzheimer's disease. These daycare centers and all that are not just dementia care centers at this point. They take care of long-term care in general. So enough about all that. And this was the result, this was the compendium of the OTA effort. The last thing I'll say is that there were about 21 staff and contractors who put this work together. It's true team sport. And OTA is the only place, despite the fact that I've worked at several universities that really pride themselves on interdisciplinary work, and it's true. ASU is really good about interdisciplinary work. Our department is called the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. It's not the Department of Chemistry or Physics or whatever. And there are people in our department that have really, really different disciplinary backgrounds. But I have to say, this is the only place that I've ever worked where interdisciplinary meant we're going to take anybody in the room who has expertise that bears on the problem that we have been asked to try to solve and think through for the folks on the Hill. And we're going to focus on the problem, not the academic prestige of who gets promoted and tenured and all that. We're going to be focusing on the problem, which drove the analysis. And in fact, we had a bunch of people here. But the point I was going to make that's really important is the two most important people on our staff were both people whose background was in social work, one of whom had written a self-help book. That was Nancy Mace, The 36-Hour Day. And the other was Katie Maslow, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but Zabin knows quite well because they worked together for decades. And is one of the most talented policy analysts I've ever met anywhere. But her background was in social work. And it was their part of the OTA project where I think the most innovation took place. But the innovation was, how do we deliver care? How do we do this better? How do we help people find each other? It wasn't taking molecules and tweaking them and turning them into a technical fix. Now, I would still love a technical fix. And the policy implication from this is not, let's not do research. It is, in fact, the ultimate technical fix for Alzheimer's disease would be, let's stop those brain cells from dying. But this is science and it's research, and we don't know if there is even such a thing to be found. Is there gold at the end of that rainbow or not? We don't know. That's the nature of research. But in the meantime, there are all sorts of forms of innovation that can take place that involve the social structures and the delivery of care, because people are still going to get Alzheimer's disease until we can fix it. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Zabin.
Thank you very much. Well, you heard an excellent part of the history of the Alzheimer's movement. My intent is to underscore, amplify some of the points that Bob made preceding how OTA program began, and another one is after OTA, what happened after OTA to the current situation, what are some of the challenges we face. I'll be talking about the intersection between science, policy, and human behavior, which sort of gets in the way. My background is in neurophysiology, and I've been interested in learning and memory. About 19, how NIH and government makes decisions what science to fund. So I became a student of the public policy on science and technology. I started taking, as a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh, I started taking courses in health law, budget process, legislative process, a variety of things that would be important. My mentor there was a man by the name of Alan Pond, who was an assistant surgeon general. He had come to government during Roosevelt's administration and had stayed through Nixon's administration in what was at that time HEW. He was there when first secretary was put, Mrs. Hobby was the first secretary at HEW. He was a confidant. So he became my mentor. About 1976, I learned about a fellowship at NIH administered through the director's office, Don Fredrickson, who invited about 5 or 6 scientists on something like the congressional fellowships. The idea was to bring people to NIH and give them license to roam around and learn how NIH operates or the government operates. So I was selected for that and took a number of assignments in various places. One assignment was with Paul Rogers on the Hill. That was an important committee because most of health law came out of that committee. Then I took assignment at OMB and through the various institutes. One of my assignments was for a newly created institute, National Institute on Aging, which was enacted in 1974, and a new director had come by the name of Bob Butler. And my assignment there was to develop a strategic plan for developing a new program on brain aging and Alzheimer's. I thought this would be a great challenge, so I did that, and at the end, Butler asked me if I would stay and try to develop that. That was 1978. So this is tantamount to, in physics, the question of how do you create matter? In science, it's how do you create a scientific program at NIH when the subject matter is very little known. Dementia, Alzheimer's was not well known. The scientific base for building was very weak. There were maybe a handful of scientists working on it. There was no budget. And there was a tremendous antipathy towards aging research on NIH, and Alzheimer's was really a joke as far as study sections go. So how do you go about generating interest, building something? It was a tremendous challenge. Remember, I'm a student. I came as a student of how do you get programs going, how do you make policies. So it became a challenge. So one of the first challenges was to struggle with the issue that Bob talked about, that is the distinction between phenomena of neurological disease and aging, in the form of the distinction between Alzheimer's and senile dementia. At that time, the prevailing conventional wisdom was that Alzheimer's was a natural part of aging. That's why it was called senility. So the first battle was trying to battle the medical scientific community that there is a phenomena here that's different and distinct from aging. So that was the first battlefront, which took for a long time and still, to some extent, still lingers on. The second battlefront was trying to recruit the very best scientists to become interested in a project, in an area, to do research. Most scientists did not see a future in doing research on aging. So my task was to convince them that there was a viable career opportunity, that there was something worthwhile doing here. So there was another big battle. The third battle was the third one, the internal organizational struggle that Bob referred to between the National Institute of Neurological Disorder, Mental Health, and Aging. Those two had legitimate claims to the topic area. The problem was that they weren't willing to put any money or any effort into it. And I had to create a program that would be distinctly different from what they had. So the strategy at NIA was to come out with a program that was drastically, substantially different. And that was the strategy to bring in the structuring of the program, a systems approach. That is to look at the problem of aging and neurological disorders from a totally different perspective. At mental health, it was being looked as a mental disorder with some very fuzzy concepts, but very little science behind it. At neurology, it was strictly looked as a clinical entity with very little basic science. At NIA, we created a program that integrated the basic science with the clinical issues. So it was vertically organized to go from genetics through neurochemistry to neuroanatomy into the behavior, into epidemiology, and into the care issues. So it was very comprehensive and a very integrated program. And it brought in, tried to bring people from different perspectives, different scientific avenues. The core issue was, scientific question was, why some individuals age healthy can continue function until age 110, 20. Picasso continued to produce until age 90. Verdi continued to be creative. The French lady that died age 122, she died healthy. Why those brains are healthy and some deteriorate at age 40, 50, 60? What is the underlying biology? That was the fundamental question around which the program was developed. The third question was, how do you get Congress to put money into a disease entity that's not known? The scientific underpinnings are weak, and the scientific community doesn't think it's a really hot area. What kind of a story can you tell to Congress that would be compelling and convince them that it's worthwhile? At that time, we approached congressmen like Cranston from California. Claude Pepper was a great supporter who had been interested in aging, and some of the other names that Bob mentioned. So the idea was to go to them each year to say, well, give us a little bit of money to see what we can do. Well, they'll say, well, what credibility can you bring? What kind of science could you bring? So the big challenge became to put together a scientific story that could be compelling enough. Well, that wasn't enough. The other component was, when I started looking around at how some of the other initiatives had worked, cancer was a good model. Mary Lasker had played a very important role in getting the NIH's agenda on the Hill. There was another woman, blocking her name now.
Florence Mahoney.
Florence Mahoney was very instrumental in child health, and she had played a role in getting NIA started. So the idea was that it became that, well, we need an advocacy group, which didn't exist. So we invited through, at that time, Bob Katzman that Bob mentioned was on the NIA Council. And Lou Thomas, who was famous, was on the NIA. So we had some very credible people on the council. Watson was very much interested in aging. They were instrumental in bringing a wealthy businessman by the name of Jerry Stone, whose wife had Alzheimer's. We invited all the groups that had been organized to NIH, and it was NIA that convened and created the Alzheimer Association with the idea that this advocacy group would help us get the message out. Unfortunately, in the early years, the association wasn't terribly interested in being advocacy. They were more interested in providing care. So, but it continued to work with us, and we worked with them in trying to build the association, and their interest in becoming involved in advocacy. By the time this meeting came about, the association had come about. They had hired a lobbying firm. Nick Cavaracci and Dom Ruscio were the major lobbyists who played a role in getting this project going, as well as getting some of the other initiatives. Now, how did the NIA and the OTA thing interact? As the program at NIA was being developed, one of the issues we were interested in was, besides building the scientific underpinnings of the disease, we also wanted to address the question of care. And at that time, I had come with a background in neurophysiology, bioengineering, and I had a great admiration for NASA. NASA used to put what's called technical briefs. They would have these 1 or 2 page ideas that they had developed that could find applications in electronics, in engineering, and so on. And the NIH was getting at that time tremendous pressure to show how the medical knowledge being developed at NIH finds applications. That process began with Johnson and continued through various administrations. Eventually, NIH created an office called Office of Medical Applications of Research for the purpose of translating technologies being developed into medical application. But the idea was technologies coming out of NIH. My interests were to find ways in which we could bring ideas being developed in NASA to applications to aging. So we had a memorandum of understanding with NASA to see how we could apply NASA-developed technologies into applications into care environment. For example, how do you bathe a person that's intensively in bed? Well, NASA came with the idea of horizontal showers. Why not develop a system where you can bathe the person in bed? Or how do you deal with incontinence in women? Develop the technology. Or how do you address the question of nutrition in an aging community where over the weekend, Wheels on Meals is not delivering food? Can you come out with some way of packaging food that could be used? The rapid freeze-drying packaging material came out of that effort to make it. So that interest was also true at Heart and Lung. And Heart and Lung, there was a guy by the name of David McCollum, who was a bioengineer. And the NIH people, Heart and Lung people, wrote about the technology and aging study that you were showing. And at that time, John Gibbons was the director of OTA, had been friends with the director of Butler. I talked to John Gibbons, can I come help you guys with this project? So once a week, I would go and help with the project that Bob was talking about. And at the end of it, started suggesting, well, maybe you should extend this to the Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is really the project. That's how the Alzheimer's project got going, and I stayed with the project. Now, let's fast forward. During this time, some of the critical issues was, to put together a scientific story that Congress could agree. By 1983, 84, we had begun to do that. We found out that there were some important biochemical changes taking place in the Alzheimer's brain. That was a hot topic in neuroscience. That's the work from Peter Davies. That gave the nidus for importing a lot of people from neuroscience to say, okay, here is a problem that you can study in actual humans rather than in animals. Another important finding was the presence of abnormal proteins, the amyloid, the tau, and we went to protein chemists to say, well, can you work out how these proteins get made, what are the genes, how it gets processed? That brought in people like Glenner and Selko. So gradually, all these various pieces that we had started come together, a story began to emerge. but we still needed something to tell a more bigger bullhorn. This was the big bullhorn to give us that voice on the hill that there is some legitimate science. About this time, we had developed we had a workshop where we developed the first diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's, particularly the neuropathological criteria. I published that in the Archives of Neurology in 1985, which sort of became the basis for a lot of the work that's going on in the area of neuropathological assessment. Then the next part was to try to create an infrastructure, because without it, we couldn't study the disease. Typically in medicine, you study a disease in a teaching hospital, cancer, heart, and so on. Well, you couldn't do that with Alzheimer's because the patients were not in teaching hospitals. They were in nursing homes. And nursing homes were not very conducive for researchers to go do that. So the centers program was created for study. They were mandated to have a clinical core, neuropathological core. That allowed us the tools, to study longitudinally what was happening with this disease. Also gave the tool for bringing the
And the way you move food is to have very high profile, stable funding sources that can build a career. And a center is a step up from an individual investigator-initiated grant program. So one of the genius things that NIA did on Alzheimer's that the other two institutes didn't do to nearly the same extent was start a centers program that told the institutions that got those center grants, hey, you're going to have this money for 5 years and it's going to be big. And it's going to involve more than just one part of your medical school. It's going to involve a whole bunch of people at your medical school. And it's going to be a critical mass that you can build on and build your reputation around. And so that was another thing that was just beginning to happen.
Very important. The other part, as part of what you're saying, is the idea of sharing data, which wasn't present at NIH. People did not want to share their data. We had, by that time, centers came, we had already created a center for collecting cells from well-characterized Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, the Nova Scotia family and some of the other family. But the people that were harvesting the cells weren't willing to share it with others. So sharing data, information was a big problem. But as Bob indicates, NIH could say, put a slight bit of pressure to say, well, if you really want to get more funding, maybe you should be sharing. Maybe you should be coordinating where you can start standardizing the assessment instruments. Maybe we should create a data bank for all the clinical data, for all the neuropathological data, so that others could come. So that began the field rolling. And that set the stage also for developing the capability for doing clinical trials, which began to happen at the tail end of this project. By 1992, we had the very first trial. Following that period, like a diesel engine, the system had begun to function quite well, and to bring to the point that Bob makes in his article is that what do we have to show after 40 years of investment in this? And he bemoans the fact that we do not have an effective treatment. And he's absolutely right. That's that we don't have a treatment. But the problem is not that the money was not wasted. That's the point, that we learned quite a bit about the disease. And there are lots of reasons why the trials did not work. By this time, this is one of the important policy issues. A big problem in science is when an idea, a theory, becomes a religious belief. Scientific orthodoxy is a killer for innovation, because anyone coming outside of the field with a new idea just doesn't have a chance. They don't have an opportunity to occur. During my tenure, I was going out of my way to bring in the mavericks into the field. And that's what made it work. I brought in somebody named by the name Alan Roses, who had never published in Alzheimer's, yet he had a different approach to the genetics, and funded him, and he gave us APOE story. Glenner wasn't getting funded, who gave us the origins of the amyloid. Dennis Selko was having problems.
Just to stop you there, one of the other little wrinkles about science is he just gave you two names, Alan Roses and George Glenner. Now, why was Alan Roses having trouble getting funding? He became the head of one of the centers at Duke. It was the second wave of the centers. And it was that center that gave rise to the ApoE story that you guys have probably heard about. This is the chromosome 19 marker that is associated not with the early onset cases like the family I showed you, but rather late onset cases. But Alan Roses was kind of a rough-edged guy.
Yeah, he was.
He was really hard to live with, and so was George Glenner. So in a way, this is what often happens in science, is you've got these outside fields, these kind of backwaters of science, but there are little stars out there, and there's some people with good ideas, but sometimes they're jerks, and they're hard to work with. And that was what was happening in Alzheimer's disease, and they needed some resources to make them behave a little bit better. That worked with Alan.
Yeah. By 1990s, we had brought in, again, along the same line, I found Stanley Prusner, who was working on one of the ideas that's having to do with the disease, was the question of whether an infectious agent can be causing it, whether it's transmissible. So I had a whole bunch of people working on scrapie virus and a variety of other, and picked up Stan Prusner, who wasn't being funded by neurology. And I was picking up projects that other institutes were not funding, because they fit into the kind of story I wanted to tell. Eventually, Stanley got the Nobel Prize, so did Paul Greengard and Eric Kandel. So the program eventually brought in some really top names to the field. Now, the field has become a household name, and we have a new set of problems, and maybe we can talk about those.
Yeah, so the problem now for Alzheimer's disease, I just came from a meeting of some of the directors of the institutes at NIH. And what's going on at NIH right now is NIA is the leader now of Alzheimer's disease, in large part because of what began in the late 1970s. Their budget for this current fiscal year is $2.3 billion. The success rate for Alzheimer's disease is going to go down to pay lines that are much lower than they are for cancer or heart disease or many of the other conditions. And there's a little bit of resentment among the other institutes that these are the guys who are getting all the money. It's all going to Alzheimer's disease. It should be coming to us. So we've actually got kind of the opposite problem of what was happening in the late 1970s and early 1980s of trying to start a field. It's now become the celebrated thing that we need to do something about. The Alzheimer's Association is now big and elaborate and bureaucratic. And so in a way, we're dealing now with the issues of the success of a movement and trying to nonetheless remain innovative. And I think that's probably the set of policy problems that are most pressing.
One of my favorite social commentators is a guy named by the name of Pogo. Pogo is a cartoon character, and one of his cartoons, he says, "We rose to face the enemy and we found the enemy is us." And in science policy, sometimes the enemy are the luminaries of science. I'll give you an anecdote, a story. The luminaries are in the form of Varmus, Richard Hodous, Collins. By mid-1980s, about this time, there were two important discoveries made that shifted NIA's strategy for therapy development. Originally, when we began in 1978, the idea of therapy development was very standard, that you look for a molecule and you do the treatment on the basis of molecule. By mid-70s, epidemiologic study began to show that there is an exponential rise in the frequency of the disease after age 65. So it doubles every 10 years. If you have 5% at age 65, it doubles to 10%, 75, doubles again. So this shape, regardless of what epidemiologic study you look at, has that shape. So that was one important finding. The other important finding was that supporting nursing research, behavioral research, psychosocial research, we began to see that this kind of research can have a tremendous impact on reducing the burden and delaying some of the onset. So taking those two findings, NIA began to shift its focus on treatment to interventions to be much broader defined, to include variety of strategies for ways in which you could find ways to delay the onset of the disease. That began to take shape in the late 80s. And by 1992, I wrote an editorial called the 5-5-10-10 Plan for Alzheimer's. What the editorial called for said, let's look for strategies to delay the onset of disabling symptoms during the next 5 years, for 5 years, and for 10 years for the next 10 years. And that if we do that, a modest delay of 5 years will cut the frequency or the prevalence in half. And I use the metaphor of putting men on the moon as the model, that identify a goal. A goal could be an impossible dream, but strive towards it. Well, the editorial did not get much attention, so we continued working. I did an intensive report, submitted to NIA, it got ignored. By 1997, I had left NIA. I was working for the Alzheimer Association and became the director of the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Research Institute. And I was invited to give testimony to a subcommittee by Senate. And the title was The Prospects for Preventing Alzheimer's. That was 1997. Again, it called for a variety of strategies for prevention. Did not get any attention. Fast forward, 2007, an Alzheimer's study group was organized by a congressional mandate with Newt Gingrich as the chair, a former speaker, and Bob Kerrey, and all luminaries, including Varmus, including number of people. Now, I knew that group did not have the scientific information they needed. So I began organizing a series of think tank meetings to provide scientific agenda to that committee, and worked with Bob Iggy, who was a staff person for Newt Gingrich. And the idea of the think tank meeting was to develop a scientific agenda with a specific asks with specific budget. And again, the proposal to them was to launch a national initiative to prevent the disease by 2020. The committee accepted that, and I sent the idea to around 150 or so leaders around the world. They all said, yeah, this is something we want to do. And it proposed $1 billion for 10 years as a strategy. That was 2009. That led to NAPA. NAPA accepted it, and now the rest is history. But the point I'm making is that during that intersections, Varmus and Hoda said, well, this is not doable. What they were doing was they were mistaking the goal with the promise. A promise has to be authentic. The proposal to prevent the disease by 2020 was not a promise, was a goal. They could not see that in science sometimes you have to articulate a vision that would serve the role of mobilizing the wide community. And the metaphor, again, is the men on the moon, where President Kennedy said, let's put men on the moon by the end of this decade. We didn't have a rocket that could get off the ground. It was not a realistic goal, technically. But what it did was it mobilized the interest, it created administrative structure to enable us to do that. And that's the model we used, and it worked.
Okay, so that's where we are now. Let's turn it over for a few minutes to you all for questions. And let me just one brief point. If you like this whole kind of approach of mixing politics and policy and science to understand where biomedicine is going, Bob will be teaching a class on that very subject in the winter.
And just a heads up, those of you who do have questions, wait for the microphone because they're streaming this, just to remind you.
Thanks.
So this was really interesting. My name is Amanda Lazar, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in College Park. And my role has to kind of do with this politics and policy piece. So my first is that you talked a lot about stories and the importance of stories, right? Building a story about dementia to make people care, but then also worrying when the story becomes something that everything buys into and stops creativity almost. And I've been seeing kind of a movement of people with dementia calling for a different story about dementia, saying that right now it's very kind of deficit-oriented, doom and gloom, and that this causes damage to them directly. And hearing about the history, it makes sense, right? The caregivers are the ones starting the Alzheimer's Association. They are dealing with it a ton. They're not being supported. But I'm just wondering about if you think a shift towards thinking about supporting people with dementia themselves, thinking about dementia as a long period of time with early, mild and moderate dementia, times where people retain lots of abilities, even if some things are failing, lots of abilities persist, like creativity. How can we support people in working longer and being more productive, all kinds of things, which I think directly has impact on caregivers, of course, and the system as a whole. And I'm just thinking about the kind of how the current story might actually hurt us in the long run, the kind of story about fear and damage and loss, and what you think the trade-offs are there. And another short question is, I've also noticed this shift. So in my training, it was always dementia is the term, and Alzheimer's disease is a kind of dementia. But I've noticed now all the kind of funding calls, everything is ADRD, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So I'm just so curious about that shift, what it does, how that decision was made, and what are kind of the benefits and also negatives about that.
Well, that's a lot of questions.
I'm sorry, I have a more.
Okay. If I have a hearing problem, so I may not have heard everything accurately, your question, but first and foremost, we've learned that the disease starts many, many years before. So the primary focus now is to deal with that issue. How do you detect those people at risk? How you deal with it? Because part of the reason that Bob's article mentions that these treatments did not work is that we started too late in the disease process to treat. That if we had started years ago, some of these treatments may have actually worked. So now the big focus in the field is for early interventions. The other idea is to go beyond the mere notion of using pharmacological approaches, but to use more lifestyle because increasing evidence indicates that some of the risk factors like vascular disease can be very, very potent in preventing it. We have now a major initiative to look for whether we can use drugs that were developed for stroke, various cardiovascular disease might be used early. We've been repurposing because they're already safe, they've been approved, we can use it. Nutrition, exercise, they're beginning to show. There's a finger study from Sweden. It's very promising. So we have some very good message to give. As to the later stages, if we can find ways in which the use of technology to alleviate some of the burden and allow them to function longer, we could reduce some of the burden. The problem in the care environment is that despite this tremendous document, there has been very little systematic research on new models of care or the application of care. The care community hasn't had the centers program to do coordinated programs. A group will start a program there and they'll start writing about it, but it's not been validated. We need the system where you could validate it on large numbers of population. That would be a policy issue, to create a national and collaborative kind of studies where you look at the efficacy of some of these interventions, which might be very, very helpful. One size is not going to fit all because the disease is very heterogeneous. There are different forms. So we have to be willing to address that question. So that's another issue. Your question about the terminology, that's a moving target. The reason, part of the reason is that people who were in the biology of the disease have a vested interest in defining Alzheimer's on the basis of the lesions in the brain. The current effort is now on the basis of biomarkers. But from the point of view of the patient and caregiver, they don't give a damn about whether you have tangles or amyloid in your brain, they're more worried about the behavioral consequences of the disease. It's the dementia that you want to cure. If we have a drug that eliminates with 100% certainty all the amyloid, all the tangles, but the dementia is still there, how many people are going to buy that drug?
Right. So, and just a couple of things for me to spin off is changing the story is, I think that is happening, and it's not happening just in Alzheimer's, it's also happening in cancer, this is a problem that we face, and it's not all black, and it's not all fear, and it's not all military metaphors. This is a part of life, and we need to deal with that, and I think that is happening, and if you look at some of the narratives that are coming out of Alzheimer's disease now, those stories are changing, and it is trying to change the fear as being the dominant, the dominant framework. On the terminology, that actually had already happened. If you look at the tables in this project, the Alzheimer's Association at that time was actually called the Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders Association. It became the Alzheimer's Association later, and I think we're seeing a move back to that. But you'll see there are 70 different causes of dementia that are listed here. That was well known at the time. But Alzheimer's disease was the thing that had changed from being a backwater to being something that was really on the agenda. So it was really Alzheimer's that drove it. But you'll see that the title was Losing a Million Minds, blah, 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 Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So, and the reason for the blah, blah, blah was, that was my original title, incidentally, was Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. In fact, it was going to be called Disorders Causing Dementia. Thank God we had a group sit around a table saying, what should the title of this report be? And one of my staff, it certainly wasn't me, came up with the idea of Losing a Million Minds, which is
really the core issue. That headline is the core issue for a variety of reasons for public policy. And if we're going to work on anything, it's to find ways in which we can slow it down or have people lose their mind 1 hour before they die.
And the final thing that I wanted to hit on is, Zaven just touched on it. If you look at the US system of biomedical research, we are terrifically good at doing science. NIH is an incredibly well-run organization that has miraculously given out billions of dollars consistently with very few scandals. There are a few. But compared to defense contracting or Medicare or Medicaid, it's a marvelous organization that actually does a pretty good job. We're really good at doing science. We are miserably bad at studying our system of care and figuring out how do we do it more efficiently, how do we do it better. We don't consider that a research thing that is high prestige, high profile, the way we treat molecular biology and cellular biology. And it's a flaw in the US system, even more than it is of other health systems. So this is one of those diseases where, in fact, maybe we broke the mold a little bit, but as Zaven is saying, there aren't the centers for how do we deliver Alzheimer's care, and do we have a national strategy for fixing that problem? We don't have that. So it's a flaw that we need to fix.
The problem has three vectors. One vector is the increasing number. The numbers are increasing because of the longevity revolution. Second problem has to do with the duration of disability. If you get the disease at age 40 or 50, you're destined to live until age 90 or 100. You have a longer period of disability. The third has to do with the care. The care issue is extremely labor-intensive, personalized, can't be automated, and often given by families. So the problem is the multiplication of those three. So in order to solve it, we have to reduce the numbers. The only way you can reduce the number is to find out exactly the cause and stop it before it occurs. That's a long way to go. Maybe we can come out with strategies for reducing the duration of disability. That was the intent of the PAD 2020, delayed or prevented by 2020. It's the current focus of NAPA to find interventions that delays it by 2025. So, and that's a very broad spectrum interventions, not just a single molecule. The cost issue is one that we're talking about, and that's going to rely on finding new strategies for taking care of. For example, why we can't have research and development in having smart homes where you bring in technologies into the home for assisting caregivers with variety of things so that the disability has been accommodated by technology. If without this glass I'm disabled, I can't see, can't put it, why not have that kind of technologies that assist in the environment of locomotion, orientation, sleep loss, all the problems, behavioral problems that are the ones that are driving people to put their loved ones into the nursing home. And that was the point of this article. This article said you have two choices. Either invest in the technologies to take care, better care, to reduce the cost, or be willing to ration healthcare for the growing number of individuals. Because right now, the projections are that Medicare and all the systems are going to go bankrupt. It's not just the United States, worldwide.
And we won't make all of our answers that long.
Hi, I'm Catherine Cook-Deegan, and walking in this building today, I couldn't help but be reminded that we're at the Bartlett O'Connor Center. And I was thinking that Sandra Day O'Connor may well appreciate a copy of this meeting in terms of, you know, Gaius Loci and so on. That's quite an arc.
And I think we have time for one last question.
Chuck, the last word, as always.
Oh, good heavens. Chuck Weiss, retired from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. I wanted to ask a question about OTA, of blessed memory. I've always felt that one of the problems with OTA is that it didn't have strong enough relations with, it didn't think part of its job was to build up capabilities in universities, which would give the art of technology, would have given the art of technology assessment more longevity, more resilience, and would have been less subject to sudden cancellation, which is what happened. But Bob also mentioned that there's a problem about the relative motivations, that universities are preoccupied with tenure and graduate students and so on. It struck me as you were speaking that this idea of centers might be some kind of a halfway house in between the two. But I wonder if you would talk about the structure of a system that could give rise to this, a resilient structure that could give rise to a more robust technology assessment discipline and practice.
Yeah, so this will shift gears to the talk about possibly bringing OTA back. The legislation that authorized OTA still exists, and all they have to do is appropriate. So they have to just supply the money, and OTA could be back in action, and there are a bunch of people talking about doing that. I don't think bringing back OTA in its old form would A, work, or B, be all that effective, even if it were, because the world has moved on, I think. And OTA, for all the things, many of us who work there have this nostalgia of this castle on the hill where everybody was happy and delightful things happened and the world was a better place. And the world was a better place. Let's be clear about that. Congress misses OTA even though it doesn't realize it. They make some decisions that are bad, that might have been fixed at the margin if they had some capacity for actually paying attention to what's going on in science and technology at a more sophisticated level. But that said, OTA had a couple of weaknesses. One was it was insular. Insular in the sense of we actually took our role as being members of congressional staff kind of seriously, and they were our clients. The clients of an OTA report were the committees that asked for it. There were collateral communities, and we had to retain credibility. I'm going to float this term of a boundary organization that political scientists talk about, which is one that has to have credibility in OTA's case in the science and technology and medicine community, and also be highly credible in long, and it got hard. But it was pretty good at that. But I do think that OTA was insular in the sense of it wasn't integrated into this robust and extraordinary resource that we have in the United States, the university system, and we didn't have very many interns. Our little program at OTA did, but we didn't have very many students milling through, and I think it's something that we didn't think through. It weakened the constituency base. The reason OTA was defunded is because there was no constituency to support it. So if you're going to lop off something, you're going to lop off something that people aren't going to screech in pain if you lop it off, and that's what they did. And so I take your point. The one thing that I would say that I worry about under a model of farming it out or outsourcing to universities is I don't think that will work if that's the only thing that's done. Because going back to this story, it was really, really, really important that we were deeply embedded in Congress, and that the meetings that we were holding were in congressional meeting rooms, and they were hearings or they were workshops that were done in the Capitol or in one of the Senate or House office buildings, which means that the people attending them are the people that you're trying to inform. And unless that feature of OTA is preserved, outsourcing it to universities I don't think will work very well. But I take your point that it would be nice to have some systematic bridges out. So I don't know what that would look like, but that's kind of how I would think about that. So if we exhausted you all, thank you so much for coming. And
thank you, Bob and Zavin, for a fascinating discussion. I'd encourage you all to please stick around. If you want to ask Bob and Zavin any additional questions, please feel free. And finish our pancakes. We've got a ton in the back, plenty of coffee. Also, please feel free to pick up a copy of Issues. And always, of course, please consider subscribing. Thanks, everyone.